In the heart of San Francisco's art district, sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of the Aurelia Tower, catching on silver frames and marble floors. Inside, everything smelled of polish and perfection. Everything except the quiet corner on the ground floor where a man sat with paint-stained hands, sketching silently. His name was Ethan Cole, a once celebrated painter who now took odd commissions and repaired murals for pocket change. His jeans were worn, his shirt rolled to the elbows, streaked with colors that refused to fade. Across the lobby, Clara Devine, CEO of Devine Holdings, walked briskly toward the elevators. Every click of her heels sounded like a decision being made. She was known for her impossible standards and her famous quote in business magazines, "Perfection isn't optional. It's the price of success." At 31, she had turned her late father's struggling company into a global luxury brand. But what most people didn't see was the emptiness behind her cold confidence. That morning, she was preparing for the company's 10th anniversary gala. The event would unveil a new headquarters gallery, featuring portraits of key figures who had shaped Devine Holdings. Clara wanted her own portrait, the grand centerpiece, to be flawless. But every artist she'd hired had failed her impossible expectations. Either the color wasn't right or the eyes were wrong, or the emotion didn't match the power she demanded. When she stepped out of the elevator, her assistant, a nervous young man named Ryan, hurried behind her. "Ma'am, the final artist just canceled. Family emergency." Clara stopped, her expression sharp as glass. "Then find another one. We've called everyone. The top galleries are fully booked. The gala's in 3 days." Clara exhaled through her nose, frustrated. "Then get someone from the local scene. Anyone who can paint realism." Ryan hesitated. "There's one man. He works down the street. Used to be famous, but now what?" Clara snapped. "He paints for small shops. People say he lost his spark." Clara's tone softened only slightly. "Bring him here. Now." An hour later, Ethan was led through the golden lobby, paint under his fingernails, sketchbook tucked under his arm. He felt completely out of place among the towering sculptures and pristine marble. Clara stood waiting by the studio room, arms folded, impatience written all over her face. "You're the painter?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes ran over his clothes, his rough hands, the faint smell of turpentine. "You don't look like one." "I didn't know art had a dress code," he replied calmly. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. She wasn't used to quiet defiance. "I need a portrait," Clara said curtly. "Large canvas, my office wall. 3 days." Ethan studied her face, the sharp jawline, the perfect red lipstick, the controlled smile. 3 days is ambitious." "You'll be paid triple your rate," she interrupted. "I just need it to look perfect." Ethan hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, but I paint truth, not perfection." Clara gave a cold laugh. "Then I suggest you learn the difference." That single line would mark the beginning of something neither of them expected. Ethan returned the next morning with his tools and easel. Clara, dressed immaculately in white, sat by the window with her laptop, pretending to check emails while stealing quick glances at the man painting her. His focus was complete, movement steady, his silence almost intimidating. The brush whispered against the canvas, and for the first time, Clara didn't speak. An hour passed, then 2. "Why aren't you using the photo I gave you?" she asked. Ethan looked up briefly. "Because photos lie. Faces don't." Clara frowned. "You're calling me a liar?" He dipped his brush again. "No, I'm saying your eyes tell a different story than your smile." For the first time in years, Clara didn't know what to say. As the hours went on, Ethan kept painting quietly. His strokes were confident, deliberate, and yet soft, like someone who understood pain too well. Clara found herself watching him more than working. There was something in his stillness that made her uncomfortable, like he saw things she spent years trying to hide. Finally, as he cleaned his brushes, she broke the silence. "How did you end up painting for small shops?" Ethan smiled faintly, eyes distant. "I used to have an exhibit in New York. Then life happened. Meaning? He shrugged. My wife was sick. I stopped chasing galleries. Some things matter more than fame. Clara didn't respond, but something shifted in her gaze. The words lingered long after he left that night. She went home to her penthouse overlooking the bay, surrounded by glass, money, and silence. For the first time in a long while, the silence felt heavy. The next morning, when Ethan arrived again, Clara was already there. Without makeup, hair tied back, no assistant, no phone. Just her and a cup of black coffee. "You're early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Wanted to see how you work." Ethan smiled gently and began painting again. The light from the window hit her face differently that morning. Not as a CEO, but as a woman. There was something fragile in her expression, and Ethan noticed. Hours passed again, and finally Clara stood, crossing her arms. "If you finish this in time," she said, "I'll forgive you for being arrogant." Ethan chuckled softly. "And if I don't?" She smiled faintly. "Then I'll never hire you again." He looked at her, eyes calm and honest. Deal. She didn't know why she said it. Maybe part of her liked the quiet challenge in his voice. Maybe she wanted to feel something real again, but deep down, she had no idea what truth his brush was already beginning to reveal on that canvas. A truth about her, hidden beneath every polished layer of her pride. The next day, sunlight crept through the tall windows of Clara's private studio, illuminating the half-finished portrait that stood at the center of the room. The canvas captured more than her image. It held something unsettling, something almost alive. Ethan's brush had found emotion in her face that even she didn't recognize. The eyes on the canvas seemed softer, sadder, as though they knew a secret Clara had long buried. She stood before it, arms crossed. "Why do I look different?" she asked quietly. Ethan didn't glance up from mixing his colors. "Different how?" "Vulnerable," she said after a pause. "I don't look like this in real life." He wiped his brush on a rag, then looked at her. "Maybe that's the part of you don't show anymore." Clara's chest tightened. She wasn't used to people talking to her like that. Most people in her world agreed, nodded, obeyed. But Ethan's calm honesty irritated her and intrigued her at the same time. She turned sharply toward the window. "You think you know me?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I don't need to. The eyes tell their own story." She faced him again. "And what story do mine tell?" He hesitated. "Someone who's learned how to survive but forgot how to feel." The room went silent. Even the ticking wall clock seemed to stop for a second. Clara wanted to lash out, to call him arrogant again. But instead, she found herself speechless. "Take a break," Ethan said softly. "You're too tense. Art needs air to breathe." She exhaled, grabbed her coffee, and stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the city. Below her, cars crawled through the streets like streams of light. Everything looked small from up here, everything except her thoughts. For the first time, she wondered if perfection had turned into a cage. Inside, Ethan continued painting. He worked like someone carrying a quiet ache inside his chest. Every stroke was deliberate, almost reverent. He paused occasionally, staring at the unfinished eyes on the canvas as if trying to understand them. There was something about this woman that reminded him of the person he used to be before grief took his art away. When Clara returned, he was cleaning his brushes. "I finished the base layer," he said. "Tomorrow I'll start with the light." She glanced at the painting again. It was strange. She could barely recognize herself. Her usual confidence, her authority, all softened by warmth and shadow. It made her uncomfortable, but she couldn't look away. "It's not what I expected," she admitted. Ethan smiled. "Good. Art shouldn't always please. Sometimes it's meant to reveal." That night, Clara couldn't shake his words. She sat in her living room surrounded by sleek furniture, large windows, and silence. On the wall behind her hung another painting, her late father's portrait. He had been a stern man, a perfectionist who taught her that power came from control. "Never let emotion cloud your judgment," he used to say. It became her mantra. But now, Ethan's painting felt like a mirror she didn't want to look into. The next morning, she arrived at the studio earlier than usual. Ethan was already there, setting up. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, his movements calm, deliberate. He didn't greet her formally, just nodded with quiet respect. Clara found that refreshing. As he worked, she watched him. He painted like someone remembering a dream, each color placed with purpose. The golden tones around her hair, the gentle light on her skin, the shadows beneath her eyes. It wasn't just art, it was understanding. "Do you ever paint for yourself?" she asked after a while. "Not anymore," he replied simply. "Why not?" "Because every time I start, I see her." Clara looked up. "Her. My wife," he said quietly. "She died 5 years ago. Cancer. I stopped painting after that. I thought if I stopped, the memories would fade." Her throat tightened. She hadn't expected that answer. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, eyes distant. "Don't be. Pain changes people. The trick is not to let it erase them." Clara turned back to the painting. Suddenly, she understood why his art felt alive. Because he painted from the space where pain and beauty meet. Something stirred in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. By the afternoon, the portrait had transformed again. The lines were softer now, more human. Clara's reflection on the canvas wasn't a CEO or a figure of power. It was a woman with history, emotion, and flaws. She almost didn't recognize her own expression. "You're changing it," she said, almost accusingly. Ethan looked at her. "No, you're changing. I'm just following." That evening, she found herself standing before the canvas long after he'd left. The studio was quiet except for the faint echo of his words. She studied the painted eyes that seemed to follow her every move. For the first time, she felt seen. The next day, rumors spread through the building. Some of the employees whispered about the strange artist in the CEO's office, painting her day after day. Clara ignored them, but deep down she noticed how different her mornings felt. The world seemed quieter, less hostile. When Ethan arrived that afternoon, she greeted him with coffee, something she'd never done for anyone at work. "Thank you," he said, surprised. She shrugged. "I figured even artists need caffeine." He chuckled softly. "You're learning." They worked in companionable silence. Every now and then, their eyes met, not as boss and worker, but as two people trying to understand each other without words. As the sun began to set, Ethan stepped back and said, "Almost done." Clara tilted her head. "Can I see?" He hesitated, then moved aside. She gasped. Her painted self looked alive. Eyes filled with depth, strength, and something fragile beneath the surface. It was her, but not the version she'd spent years perfecting. This one felt real, almost painfully so. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan looked at her quietly. "It's honest." She stood there for a long moment, unable to speak. For the first time in her career, Clara Devine felt stripped of her armor. When she finally found her voice, it was soft. "Finish this painting and maybe I'll forgive you for showing me what I've been running from." Ethan smiled gently. "Then I'll make sure it's worth your forgiveness." Neither of them knew that the portrait would soon reveal more than either of them expected. Not just about her, but about the truth connecting them in ways they couldn't yet see. The day of the unveiling approached fast. The grand hall of Divine Holdings buzzed with preparations for the 10th anniversary gala. Silver chandeliers hung like frozen rain, and workers carried crates of decorations, glass sculptures, and portraits through the echoing corridors. But at the heart of all the noise, in a quiet studio on the top floor, Ethan Cole stood before Clara's nearly completed painting. The portrait was almost finished, almost, but not quite. Something still lingered between the strokes, something incomplete. He stared at the eyes he had painted, soft, searching, vulnerable. Yet, deep within them, he sensed a missing light, a question unanswered. Behind him, the door opened softly. Clara stepped inside, her reflection flickering on the polished floor. She wasn't dressed like the usual CEO today. No heels, no designer outfit. Just a simple navy blouse and slacks, her hair loose, her face unguarded. "How's it coming along?" she asked. Ethan didn't turn. "Almost done, but I keep feeling there's something more." "Something more?" she repeated. He nodded. Something the painting still wants to say. She stepped closer, eyes tracing her own face on the canvas. You make it sound alive. It is, he said softly. Every portrait is. You don't paint faces. You paint the truth they're afraid to show. Clara's gaze lingered on her painted eyes. And what truth is mine showing? Ethan hesitated. That you've spent your whole life building walls, thinking they'll protect you. But now you're realizing they've only kept you alone. Clara inhaled sharply, her throat tightening. For a moment she wanted to deny it, to remind him he was just an artist, that he didn't know her. But the truth hit too deep. She turned away, arms crossed, staring out the window. You talk like you've known me forever. I know pain, he replied quietly. And I know what it looks like when someone hides it behind control. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with words neither dared to speak. Finally, Clara said softly, Do you ever miss her? Ethan's jaw tightened. Every day. Then why keep painting? Because that's the only way I still talk to her. Clara looked at him, really looked. There was no pity in her gaze, just quiet understanding. For the first time, she saw Ethan not as a worker, but as a man carrying his own kind of perfection. Honesty. As he turned back to the canvas, the last brushstroke hesitated in midair. Clara's voice broke the silence again, this time gentler. Can I ask you something? He nodded. If you could paint me the way you see me, not the way I want the world to see me, what would it look like? Ethan's eyes lifted to hers. You really want to know? She nodded. He smiled faintly. Then come here. Confused but curious, she stepped closer. He dipped his brush into a faint shade of gold and, with steady hands, began to add light to the portrait's background. You've built your life around control, he said softly as he worked. But underneath that is a woman who wants to be understood. Not as a CEO, not as a brand, just as herself. The colors shimmered like dawn across the canvas, wrapping her painted self in warmth. That, he said finally, stepping back, is how I see you. Clara stood in silence, staring at the transformed portrait. For the first time, it didn't make her uneasy. It made her feel human. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. You said you stopped painting for yourself after your wife passed. Then why paint this? Ethan hesitated. Because this one felt different. Because somehow, I think she'd want me to. Something in his tone broke through Clara's defenses completely. The woman who built empires, who never cried in public, suddenly felt tears sting her eyes. I wish I had known her, she said softly. Ethan smiled sadly. You'd have liked her. She had your stubbornness. They both laughed lightly, the tension fading for a moment. But as their laughter quieted, a deep stillness returned. One charged with something unspoken. Tomorrow's the gala, Clara said after a long pause. They'll see the portrait for the first time. Are you ready? He asked. She thought for a moment, then shook her head. No, but maybe that's the point. He gave a small nod. Sometimes the truth isn't comfortable, but it's always beautiful. The next evening, the grand hall glittered with gold and light. Guests in gowns and tuxedos mingled, champagne glasses clinking softly. Cameras flashed, music played, and journalists whispered about the mysterious portrait that would be unveiled that night, the one painted by an unknown artist the CEO had personally chosen. Behind the curtains, Clara stood still, her heart pounding. She glanced at Ethan, who stood quietly to the side, dressed simply in a black shirt and jacket. You nervous? He asked. She smiled faintly. Terrified. He leaned closer and whispered, Then you're alive. The host stepped up to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've been waiting for, the unveiling of the Divine Holdings anniversary portrait, representing the spirit of the company's journey and its remarkable leader, Ms. Clara Devine. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd as the curtain fell. The portrait stood tall, bathed in warm light. The crowd gasped. It wasn't the image of power they expected. It was something deeper. Clara's painted self looked real, raw, human. The eyes spoke of ambition, pain, and compassion all at once. It was not a woman of stone, but of strength through vulnerability. Some whispered. Some even teared up. The applause began softly, then grew, filling the hall. Clara turned to Ethan, eyes glistening. "You did it," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "We did." But as the crowd swelled around them, something strange happened. A familiar man in a dark suit approached, holding a glass of champagne and wearing a smug smile. Clara froze. "Clara Devine," he said with smooth arrogance. "Still chasing meaning in your image, I see." She stiffened. "Victor." Ethan looked between them silently. Victor smirked. "Ah, so this is the painter? The janitor turned artist everyone's talking about? How poetic." The insult hung in the air. Ethan didn't flinch. He just smiled calmly. Clara stepped forward. "Watch your words, Victor." But Victor laughed. "Come on, Clara. You think a man like him understands your world?" The crowd quieted. Eyes turned toward them. Ethan looked at Clara, his voice quiet but steady. "He's right. I don't understand her world. But maybe that's why I can see what others can't." The room went silent. Even Victor's smirk faded. Clara's eyes met Ethan's, and in that moment, under the glare of flashing cameras and glittering chandeliers, she realized something she never expected. The man who had painted her had done more than reveal her truth. He had become part of it. And though the portrait stood between them, glowing with the warmth of honesty, both of them knew this was just the beginning of something neither of them had planned. The applause still echoed in the grand hall, fading into murmurs as guests drifted toward the portrait, admiring every stroke of color, every shadow that told a story deeper than words. But for Clara, the noise blurred into the background. She stood there, motionless, her eyes locked on Ethan across the room. The warmth of the lights couldn't hide the storm building quietly inside her. Victor's mocking words still rang in her mind. The janitor turned artist everyone's talking about. She hated how he said it, how he twisted something pure into something cheap. But what unsettled her even more was Ethan's silence, his calm acceptance. There was a quiet strength in that stillness, something she couldn't explain but couldn't stop thinking about. After the crowd began to thin, Clara found him near the balcony overlooking the city lights. He stood alone, hands in his pockets, looking more like a man lost in thought than an artist basking in praise. "You didn't stay for the interviews," she said softly, stepping closer. He smiled faintly. "Wasn't my night." "It was," she insisted. "That painting, it changed everything." Ethan turned to face her. "Maybe. But paintings don't change the world, Clara. People do." She looked at him for a long moment, trying to read his expression. "You don't like the attention, do you?" "I used to," he said, his gaze distant. "Before I learned it doesn't fill what's empty inside." Clara's eyes softened. "You talk like you've lived 100 lives." Ethan chuckled quietly. "Sometimes it feels that way." They stood in silence, the city stretching endlessly below them. The cool night wind carried the distant hum of traffic, and for a fleeting moment Clara felt peaceful. Not powerful, not in control, just alive. But that peace shattered when Victor's voice echoed from behind them. "Touching scene," he sneered. The CEO and her painter standing under the stars. "Very cinematic," Clara turned sharply. "Victor, don't start." "Oh, I'm not starting," he said smoothly, holding a glass of champagne. "Just reminding you who you are. You can play this artistic redemption game all you want, Clara, but people are watching. Investors, board members. They won't like this. Association." Ethan didn't move, but his eyes grew colder. "Association?" Victor smirked. "You're talented, I'll give you that. But you're still a nobody who fixes murals for pocket change." Clara stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Enough," Victor raised his brow. "Defending him? My, how times have changed." He leaned in, his voice dripping with mockery. "Or maybe you just like rescuing broken things." Before Clara could respond, Ethan spoke quietly. "You're right, Mr. Lang, I am broken. But at least I don't pretend I'm whole." Victor's smile faltered. For the first time, his arrogance met something he couldn't intimidate. Honesty. Clara's heart pounded. She turned to Ethan, her voice trembling with emotion. "Come with me." She led him away from the noise, through the corridor lined with framed photographs, each marking a milestone in her company's rise. They stopped in her private office, the same room where he'd painted her for days. The faint smell of oil paint still lingered in the air. Clara closed the door behind them and leaned against her desk. "I'm sorry about him," she said quietly. "He's been trying to control this company ever since my father died." Ethan nodded. "People like him mistake cruelty for strength." She looked up. "You're not angry?" He smiled faintly. "I've been called worse." She hesitated. "But why didn't you say anything earlier, when he mocked you in front of everyone?" "Because," he said softly, "some people only understand silence." Clara studied him, her chest tightening. There was something about the way he spoke, simple, grounded but layered with experience, that drew her closer. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't afraid of her power. He just was. She took a deep breath. "You said earlier that paintings don't change the world. But yours, this one, it changed me." Ethan met her gaze. "Maybe it didn't change you. Maybe it reminded you who you were before the world demanded perfection." Her voice dropped. "And who was that?" "A girl who wanted to build something beautiful, not control everything around her." The words hit her like a quiet truth she'd been avoiding for years. She turned away, blinking fast. "You see too much." "I only see what's real," he said gently. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt heavy with emotion, yet calm, like a confession waiting to happen. Then Ethan walked toward the canvas that still stood on the easel, covered with a light cloth. He lifted the edge, revealing a small corner near the bottom. Clara frowned. "What's that?" she asked. He hesitated. "A hidden brushstroke. Something I added at the end." She stepped closer, curiosity sparking. "Show me." Ethan slowly pulled away the cloth. Beneath her painted figure, hidden in the shadowed background, was a faint outline. A second face, half-formed, soft, almost ghostly. It was a woman's face. Clara gasped. "Who is she?" Ethan's eyes were distant, his voice low. "My wife." The words hung in the air like a whisper of memory. "You painted her into my portrait?" Clara asked, almost in disbelief. He nodded. "I didn't mean to at first, but as I painted you, I saw her in the light, in the way you looked at the world when you thought no one was watching. She believed people could be both strong and kind. You reminded me of her." Clara's throat tightened. "So all this time," Ethan smiled faintly, "all this time I wasn't just painting you. I was saying goodbye to her." Tears welled in her eyes, and for a long moment she couldn't speak. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Ethan, why tell me now?" He looked into her eyes. "Because you deserve to know what the portrait truly means. It's not just your story. It's ours. It's about loss, rediscovery, and forgiveness." She blinked hard, struggling to steady her breathing. "And what do I do with that truth?" He smiled softly. "Live it." Clara turned back to the portrait, her own painted face staring back with warmth and sadness, now sharing space with a woman she'd never met but somehow felt connected to. For the first time, the perfectionist CEO felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. Not from control, but from acceptance. As she looked at Ethan, she realized something quietly powerful. This man hadn't just painted her portrait. He had rewritten her story. Outside, the city lights shimmered like stars against glass. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of applause still lingered, but in that quiet room, only one truth remained. Sometimes, art doesn't imitate life. It heals it. The next morning, the sun rose softly over San Francisco, spilling light through the wide glass windows of the Divine Tower. The gala had ended, but its echoes lingered everywhere. In articles praising the portrait, in headlines calling it the most human CEO depiction of the decade. Yet, inside Clara's office, the world seemed hushed. She stood before the painting again. Every time she looked at it, she saw something new, something deeper. The light across her painted face seemed alive now, almost whispering a story only she could hear. The faint image of Ethan's late wife hidden in the shadows didn't haunt her. Instead, it grounded her, made her feel part of something bigger than ambition. The door opened quietly. Ethan stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd be here," he said with a gentle smile. Clara turned, smiling faintly. "You figured right." He handed her the cup, and they stood side by side, gazing at the painting that had changed both of their lives. For a long time, neither spoke. There was comfort in the silence, the kind of peace that comes only when words are no longer needed. Finally, Clara said softly, "You know, I used to hate silence." Ethan glanced at her. "And now," she said, smiling gently, "it feels like breathing." He looked back at the painting. "It's strange. I thought finishing this would bring closure, but it feels more like a beginning." Clara turned to him, studying his face. "Maybe that's what art is. A door we don't expect to walk through." For a moment, their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but understanding. The kind that only 2 people carrying quiet scars could share. A soft knock interrupted them. Ryan, Clara's assistant, poked his head in. "Ma'am, you have visitors. They said they're from Divine Memorial Foundation." Clara frowned. "I didn't schedule anything with them today." Ryan hesitated. "They said it's about your father's old scholarship program." Clara nodded slowly. "Send them in." 2 women entered. Older, kind-faced, holding folders marked with the foundation's logo. One of them smiled warmly. "Ms. Devine, thank you for seeing us. We wanted to talk about your father's legacy project, the art scholarship fund he established years ago." Clara blinked. "That program still exists?" "Yes, ma'am," the woman said, "though it's been inactive since the pandemic. We're reviewing old records to see if we can revive it. We thought you might want to know about some of the first recipients." She opened the folder, pulling out an old photo. It was a group of young artists standing in front of a gallery wall. Clara leaned closer and froze. There, among them, was Ethan Cole. Her breath caught. She looked at Ethan, stunned. He blinked, just as surprised. The woman continued cheerfully, unaware of the tension. "Yes, Ethan Cole. He received your father's first art grant 15 years ago. Mr. Devine was very fond of his work. Said he had the kind of heart that paints what others fear to feel." Clara's eyes softened. "My father said that?" The woman smiled. "Oh, yes. He believed Mr. Cole's work would redefine realism." Ethan's voice was quiet, touched with disbelief. "I had no idea your father remembered me. He came to my exhibition once, before everything fell apart." Clara turned toward him slowly. "Ethan, all this time you never knew?" He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No, I thought that scholarship came from a random sponsor. I didn't know it was your father." Silence filled the room. Heavy, emotional, but warm. Clara felt her throat tighten. It was as if fate had tied their lives together long before they ever met. The women thanked Clara for her time and left. When the door closed, she turned back to Ethan, eyes glistening. "He believed in you," she whispered. "Even then," Ethan nodded slowly, "and you gave me the chance to paint again. Maybe that's the same kind of belief." She looked at him, heart full. "You know, he used to tell me that art reveals what business hides. I never understood what he meant until now." Ethan smiled. He was right. Art doesn't build walls, it breaks them. For a while, neither spoke. The weight of what they'd just learned lingered in the air. 2 paths that had unknowingly crossed years ago, now converging again through the same gift her father had left behind. Finally, Clara said softly, "I want to restart that scholarship. Not in my father's name, in yours. The Ethan Cole Foundation for Emotional Art. For artists who create from truth, not perfection." Ethan stared at her, stunned. "Clara, that's not—" She interrupted gently. "It is. You reminded me that power isn't about control. It's about creating space for others to breathe." He exhaled slowly, his voice quiet. "You're sure about this?" She nodded. "Completely." For the first time in years, Clara felt free. like the weight of legacy, expectation, and perfection had finally lifted. Ethan set his coffee down and looked at her with quiet admiration. "Your father would be proud of you." She smiled through misty eyes. "Maybe, but I think he'd be even prouder of you." The moment stretched. Peaceful, beautiful, real. Outside, the city shimmered beneath the morning sun. Inside the studio, the painting glowed with that same golden light. Two souls, bound by art, grief, and rediscovery. As Ethan turned to leave, Clara's voice stopped him. "Ethan?" He looked back. "Fly this dream," she said softly, her eyes shining. "And I'll walk beside you." He smiled, that quiet, knowing smile she had come to recognize. "Then I'll paint the path as we go." They both stood there for a heartbeat longer, their unspoken promise hanging in the air, one born not of perfection, but of truth. And as the sunlight kissed the portrait behind them, the faint faces within seemed to glow, not as separate souls, but as one story finally complete. The end.